Oh yeah, thanks everybody for being here. We're gonna record the meeting, but just so you know, we're hoping to make the video available to folks, but it will just have the screen sharing and then my face or Lorna's face, whoever's talking. So you will be anonymous, and we'll stop recording for the discussion part of the hour. So hopefully that's okay with everyone. We're hoping to be able to disseminate this a little more widely amongst Alaskan districts and education stakeholders. So thanks everybody for being here. I'm Ilana Umansky. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oregon, and I'm really happy to be presenting with my friend and colleague Lorna Porter today. And we want to recognize our other two co-authors, Elijah Moreno, who's now at the Center for Indian Country Development, and Ashley Pearson from REL Northwest, who is right now home with her very newborn baby. So we're very grateful to them, and we're gonna present on their behalf as well. So we're presenting this recently published REL report entitled Alaska Native Students as English Learner Students, Examining Patterns in Identification, Classification, Service Provision, and Reclassification. And we're hoping to talk for about 30-40 minutes and then leave the rest of the time for discussion, because we're really excited to hear from all of you, your reflections, experiences, thoughts, questions, etc. So it's a pretty intimate group today, and we're looking forward very much to the conversation. So just to give you a teeny bit of background about the REL Northwest, it's one of 10 regional education laboratories across the United States that serve their respective geographic regions. And the goal of the REL program is to help states and districts use data to address important policy issues and improve educational practice. The REL provides these services to local stakeholders, generally through research alliances. And U.S. Department of Education's IES selects organizations to operate each REL through a competitive bidding process, and Education Northwest holds the contract for the REL Northwest, although neither Lorna nor I actually work there. We're both at University of Oregon, but we're representing the REL today. I want to recognize the land that I'm speaking to you from today, which is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, which is shown in this map in light yellow, and it's the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the US government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants of the Kalapuya people are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and they continue to make very important contributions in their communities here at the University of Oregon, across the land we now refer to as Oregon, and around the world. So today we're going to be talking about this REL report, and we'll give you a little bit of motivation for the study, talk about the research methods, data sources, and research questions, data sources, methods, and focus in on the findings and implications, and hope to have a conversation with all of you, especially about those implications. We want to acknowledge a lot of help that we got for this report, some of whom are in the room today, so thank you so much. We're grateful for the insights and feedback, especially from Joel Isaac and Kelsey Smiley of DEED, and also Dr. John Shields, Dr. Seekman, and Dr. Marlowe of the University of Alaska, so thank you so much. So I'm gonna present sort of the context, and then I'm gonna pass it over to Lorna. So this work is situated between English learner education on the one hand and education that supports Indigenous students on the other. And of course, within that intersection is education that supports Indigenous students who are classified as English learners. And because of that, I'm going to give you a little bit of context about Indigenous education and English learner education. I know there are folks in the room who know a tremendous amount about one or both of these areas, so forgive the very broad overview here. But with regard to Indigenous education, education of Indigenous students is rooted in a historical pattern of imposed government schooling, heritage language deprivation, and forced cultural assimilation. Alaska Native, American Indian, and Native Hawaiian communities have faced and continue to face critical barriers to access culturally and linguistically sustaining, adequately resourced, and equitable schooling. And I should say too that when we use the term Indigenous in this presentation, we are referring to Alaska Native, American Indian, and Native Hawaiian communities. But of course, this study is focused on Alaska Native students. Although American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students make up a very small percent of English learners, so about 1.5%, close to 10% of Indigenous students in the US are classified as English learners. So about 1 in 10 Indigenous students in the US is EL classified. That said, policy and research has focused very exclusively on the needs and experiences of immigrant origin English learner students. And because of that, there are critical gaps in understanding how English learner student policies function for Indigenous students specifically. So in Alaska, it's an open question whether and how English learner student policies and services meet the unique needs and contexts of Indigenous English learner students. And that's really where we're trying to address those gaps in this study. So examining the characteristics of Alaska Native EL students and their schooling can support the development of more responsive policies. In addition, a clearer understanding of how Alaska Native EL students experience English learner student identification, classification, service provision, and reclassification can guide policy and research efforts to ensure that Alaska Native EL students receive appropriate supports for their heritage language, any needs for English language development and academic development without replicating patterns of forced linguistic and cultural assimilation. So English learner classification, a little context here, it was born out of civil rights efforts. EL classification denotes a protected status for schools, for students in schools when those students are identified as not yet speaking English such that they can fully access instruction in English. So students are evaluated for English learner student eligibility when they first enter school, which for most students is in kindergarten. However, and this is this last bullet point here on the slide, federal law differentiates eligibility for English learner student classification for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Specifically, non-Indigenous students must have a non-English language as their primary language, whereas Indigenous students are eligible if they, and this is quoting from ESSA, federal law, if they come from an environment where a language other than English has had a significant impact on their English proficiency. So federal guidance has not defined what they mean by coming from an environment or by significant impact, but this criterion suggests that Indigenous students whose primary language is English could be eligible for EL classification. Classification as an English learner puts into motion support services, primarily English language development instruction, accessible core content instruction, and sometimes academic instruction in students' home languages, although bilingual programs are the least prominent EL service right now. Furthermore, all English learner students are supposed to participate in yearly evaluation to determine whether each student has gained English proficiency sufficient to be reclassified or exited out of English learner status. So English learner classification is designed to be a temporary classification that students have when they first enter school. They're given services to acquire the English they need to be successful in school, and then they exit or reclassify. So that's a little background on English learner education. And finally, talking a little bit about the setting and context, which I know many of you know much better than me. But Alaska is one of 9 states where an Indigenous heritage language is amongst the top 5 languages of English learners in the state. And Alaska also has the highest percentage of EL students who have an Indigenous heritage or home language. Over 40% of Alaska's EL students are Alaska Native, so about 6,500 out of 16,000 EL students. And strengthening supports for Alaska Native students who are classified as ELs has been identified as a key priority area for Alaska's education leaders, both at the state level and at district levels. So before I pass it off to Lorna, I just want to bring in one little, I want to tell you briefly about another study that Lorna and I have been working on, which sort of complements this work of this REL report. And it's an impact evaluation, because one of the things we don't ask in this particular study that we're presenting today is, what is the effect of EL classification on students' outcomes? So we try to do this in this separate study, and I'm happy to send the white paper. It's not published yet, but we have a white paper version to anybody that would like one. We have our emails at the end of the deck here. What we found, we used a regression discontinuity design for anybody that's interested in that. So basically what that does is it compares students who come in and take the English proficiency test and score just above the EL threshold, so they're not classified as an EL, and those who score just below the EL threshold, so they are classified as an EL, and it tracks their progress over time, with the idea that those students are so similar to each other that if we see them going in different directions, that we can attribute that to their EL classification. So what we find in that study is that on average, EL classification had a negative impact on grades 3 and 4 English language arts and math for Alaska Native students. Interestingly, we did not see a parallel negative effect for non-Alaska Native EL students. So this seems to be pointing to the possibility that English learner services as currently implemented may not be working well, at least for this group of Alaska Native students who are testing very close to the EL threshold when they first come into school. I should also note that we also looked at special education identification differences and attendance differences, and we did not find any effect of EL classification there. So I think in general, these findings emphasize the importance of looking at patterns in English, in Alaska Native English learner identification, classification, service provision, and reclassification. And with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Lorna.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alana. As Alana said, my name is Lorna Porter. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oregon, and I'm gonna take us through until I hand it back off to Alana. So just looking at like what were the research questions we looked at in this study, the first was really trying to get a landscape of the Alaska Native EL population in Alaska, asking what percentage of Alaska Native kindergarten students are classified as English learner students, and then how did this relate to different school and student characteristics. The second question, we really got to kind of dive into 4 different districts. And these were districts with large Alaska Native or English learner student populations, and really look at what processes are used to classify English learner students and how, if at all, did they vary by whether a student was Alaska Native or not Alaska Native. Then we kind of backed back out and we looked across 26 districts that had these English learner student plans of service, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and really look at those plans of service to see what the key services were that are provided to English learner students. And then again, kind of what, if any, are specifically targeted to the education experiences and needs of Alaska Native students who are also classified as English learners. And then finally, and then I'll hand this back off to Alana when we get to the findings point, really looking at the reclassification outcomes of Alaska Native English learner students, and then seeing if patterns in reclassification differ between Alaska Native and non-Alaska Native English learner students, and then kind of looking within Alaska Native English learner students to see if there are different patterns by different student characteristics. So we use lots of different data to get at these different questions. The first and kind of big data source we used was statewide student level records provided by the Alaska Department of Education and Early Development. And this ranged from 2011-12 to 2018-19 and was about 85,000 students. We also collected publicly available data on school and district characteristics to try to put more context around the student experiences we saw in there. And then, like I mentioned, we worked with 4 districts, and they were gracious enough to share the results of student level initial English language proficiency assessments, or screeners, which we then linked to the main data set. And the reason we had to work with those individual districts is that DEED doesn't collect at the state level results from initial English language proficiency screeners. And so we worked with these 4 districts, and that was about 13,000 students, and about 2,000 or 3,000 of those were screened for EL classification. We also did interviews with district English learner student directors in those 4 different districts. And then finally, we had access to these district English learner plans of service. And so in Alaska, all districts with 8 or more English learner students in a given year have to put together this English learner plan of service. And 26 districts in Alaska met that criteria. All are current through 2020-21. And this really represents the vast majority of English learners in the state of Alaska. I think it's like over 90% of English learners are served within districts that have these plans. All right. And just like the data sources varied by question, the methods we used to answer each one did as well. The first one were descriptive analyses of student and school characteristics. And then the second one was, again, descriptive analyses, but now using that smaller subset of screener scores, as well as qualitative coding and analysis of those district EL interviews we did. The third research question, we drew on those English learner plans of service, which we also coded. And we really focused there on what services broadly are being provided to English learners in Alaska. And then again, were there any specific mentions within these plans of service about English learner services specifically meeting those educational needs in context of Alaska Native students? And then the fourth one, we drew on that statewide data set and used survival analyses. And so what those do is estimate the probability that an individual experiences an event in a given time frame. And so in this case, that's the probability that a student was reclassified as fluent English proficient in a given year, contingent on not have been reclassified earlier. So results from these analyses describe patterns in reclassification, both among Alaska Native and non-Alaska Native English learner students, and then illustrate the relationships of different student and school characteristics to these reclassification outcomes. So what did we find? Kind of looking again at this first research question, really getting at the landscape of the student population. We found that from 2011-12 to 2018-19, 15% of Alaska kindergarten students overall were initially classified as English learners. So as students were coming into kindergarten, they were classified as English learners. But if you kind of look within that 15%, we found that twice as many Alaska Native kindergarten students were classified as English learners as compared to non-Alaska Native students. So 24% compared to 12%. We also kind of then looked at different student characteristics, and we found that Alaska Native English learner students were more likely to be economically disadvantaged, although we're measuring that kind of within this idea of a cash-based economy and not accounting for subsistence-based economic well-being, which might be particularly important for the Alaska Native community. And you can kind of see on these two left bars over here, those are Alaska Native English learner students is the black bar, and then non-Alaska Native English learner students, the red bar, both of which are more likely to be economically disadvantaged than non-EL students, although higher for Alaska Native students. We found that Alaska Native English learner students had similar rates of ever receiving special education services. You can see kind of here again, these are similar, although both are lower than the blue bar, which is Alaska Native non-English learner services students. And then finally, we found that English learner students overall were less likely to be considered kindergarten ready than non-English learner students when they were coming in. And so this is assessed the Alaska Developmental Profile, or the ADP, which kind of has 5 domains and 13 goals. And really what we're finding here is English learner students overall had very similar rates of coming in as being kindergarten ready, which were lower than non-EL students. And then we kind of looked at kind of the school characteristics for students, and we found that the percentage of kindergarten students who were Alaska Native English learner students was highest in rural schools. And you can see it's much higher here in rural remote schools. And then again, higher in schools that had a higher proportion of economically disadvantaged students. So kind of moving to that next research question, looking in at these 4 schools and really trying to get at processes of identification and then how they might vary for non-Alaska and Alaska Native students. Really, directors reported that there was no differentiation in their classification processes, that really it didn't matter whether a student was Alaska Native as compared to Alaska Native. And really all 4 districts talked about the state developed home language survey as this important first step in English learner student identification. But they also talked about the use of the state provided language observation checklist. And this was an option for teachers if they believed that a non-English language had had a significant impact on a student's English proficiency. And so that significant impact language is what Alana was talking about earlier in that federal policy differentiation. So they talked about how they didn't talk about this specifically in the context of Alaska Native students, but if we think about that differentiated definition, you can see that it's much more likely that this checklist would be used for Alaska Native students. And what this checklist does is let teachers compare students speaking, listening, reading, and writing to those, quote, of standard English speaking students of the same age. And so we're really seeing there this identification of looking at different varieties of English. And we'll talk about that in this next part, where we say that directors also really felt that the majority of Alaska Native English learner students were classified as English learners because of this impact of a heritage language on their English language proficiency. And so they felt that relatively few spoke a language other than English as their primary language. Although really in what's seen in this quote, they were acknowledging that there's a lot of variation within the linguistic profiles of these students. So here talking about maybe that Indigenous language is spoken quite a bit at home and it's influenced the language, or maybe there's not strong heritage language in the home, or maybe the English itself has not been strongly developed because of kind of that historical context. And so this quote both exemplifies variation, but we also think it's an interesting example of how varieties of the English language other than the standard American English we often privilege and assess in US classrooms are perceived to be language deficiencies rather than the really whole valid varieties of English that they are. So kind of now moving to the services question, we looked at these 26 districts with English learner plans of service to really look at the key services provided to English learners, and then what, if any, were specifically kind of adapted for or targeting to Alaska Native English learner students. So first, and I guess this comes more from the interviews, but really there was this idea across the district EL directors that current EL supports were insufficient. And they identified a couple different areas where they felt like they were really lacking in supports and resources, chief among them being staffing and professional development challenges, such as having sufficient financial resources, recruiting and retaining enough English learner student and bilingual teachers, and then providing appropriate and sufficient professional development, both for English learner specialists and for general education teachers who work with English learner students. And there was a sense that limited resources resulted in English learner resources being concentrated on kind of a smaller number of students who needed those most intensive supports, whereas students who were perceived to have less acute language needs or in schools with fewer English learner students received limited, if any, English learner supports. So then now moving to those English learner student plans of service, we found that 8 of 26 districts reported providing services specifically targeted to support Alaska Native English learner students. And so services within that included Alaska Native heritage language programs, community outreach efforts, and then collaboration between Alaska Native education programs and English learner student programs. We found that 6 of 26 districts reported in their plans of service having at least one Alaska Native or bilingual or Alaska Native bilingual heritage language program, and 2 districts actually offered more than one program. And we found again that 6 of 26 districts reported in these services plans that they did conduct outreach to the Alaska Native community and family to support English learner students. So as one example, a plan described how a district administrator worked with a UPIC instructional coach to conduct community and family meetings in villages to really promote the use of 2 languages at home and also encourage family involvement in their child's education. In another district, Alaska Native community elders were invited to spend time with students during meals, and then also to teach classes kind of focused on Alaska Native cultural elements. And then finally, as one example, a district described how their Alaska Native services worked with their English learner services to put on an annual celebration, spotlighting students' cultural and linguistic heritage. And so while some districts really did provide these services separately, and we didn't find evidence of kind of overlap in these plans, again, there is evidence that there are joint services kind of being offered through collaboration between the Alaska Native Education Program and English learner student programs. And so just to highlight kind of another example, in an interview, one English learner student director with a very large population of Alaska Native students really felt like the district's English learner student services were really tightly woven with the Alaska Native cultural education offerings. And they really saw English learner classification not as kind of an indication of language deficit, but as an opportunity to develop the students' heritage and English language fluency. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Alana.
Thanks, Lorna. Okay, so for this last research question, we were looking at reclassification outcomes, both how reclassification of Alaska Native English learner students compares to that of non-Alaska Native English learner students, and also variation amongst Alaska Native English learner students. So I'll start by saying that what we found is that time to reclassification across the board in Alaska appears to be considerably longer than what's found in other states and districts. So in general, what's been found across the country is about 5 to 7 years is typical for gaining full English proficiency, passing that access or English proficiency assessment and then exiting reclassification. We found that the timeline is far longer in Alaska, but particularly for Alaska Native English learner students. So this figure on the left represents just raw data. There's no modeling here. So what we can see is the cumulative proportion of kids who are reclassified across grades as they're moving through school. And the blue line represents non-Alaska Native English learner students, and the orange line represents Alaska Native English learner students. So we can see that by the end of 5th grade, for example, which is considered in a lot of the reclassification literature like a key point at which you want to be reclassified, because middle school you start going to different periods usually during the day, and you get sort of tracked into an English learner track oftentimes. So by 5th grade, only 9% of Alaska Native English learner students had been reclassified, compared to 28% of non-Alaska Native English learner students. And we were able to track through the 7th grade. And you can see by the 7th grade, cumulative reclassification rates were almost 3 times higher for non-Alaska Native English learner students, 30%, compared to Alaska Native English learner students, which was 11%. So these are pretty striking findings if you're familiar with the reclassification literature. The figure on the right is adjusted reclassification. So here's where we're saying, well, it could be that partially the differences we're seeing between Alaska Native and non-Alaska Native English learner reclassification trajectories have to do with the context that the students are in, or other characteristics of the schools, districts, or students. So here we're controlling for a whole bunch of student, school, and district variables to try to see if that gap goes away. And what you can see here is that about half of the gap does go away, but there still is a considerable gap left over, with an estimated reclassification rate of 20% of Alaska Native EL students by the end of 7th grade, and 31% of non-Alaska Native EL students. So then we turn to look at patterns of reclassification within the Alaska Native EL student population. I'm going to just show you some of the highlights of this. The figure on the left shows cumulative reclassification rates. Now this is all Alaska Native EL students, but it's by school locale. So looking at urban schools is the dark blue, all the way to rural remote schools is sort of the dark orange there. And as you can see in the figure, this was one of our primary predictors of reclassification outcomes, with students attending schools in rural remote areas having far lower cumulative reclassification rates over time than students who are in, for example, urban areas. And then similarly, in the figure on the right, we also saw large gaps between students who are coming from families that were eligible for free or reduced price lunch and students who are not eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So we did see these sort of big reclassification gaps here as well. Next, just 2 other factors where we saw some gaps, although smaller gaps. And here you can see that reclassification outcomes were higher and faster for female students compared to male identified students, and for students who never received special education services or identification compared to students who did receive special education services or identification. So that's some of the variation we saw within Alaska Native English learner students' reclassification patterns. So we're going to close with just a conversation about implications, and here we really want to hear from you as well. And we've got some questions to sort of start the discussion going, but we really want to hear whatever it is that you all want to talk about. But first, I'll just go through some of these implications. So a first implication that we talk about is the potential for collecting and analyzing data on English learner student policy and services for Indigenous students and for Alaska Native students specifically. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. As Lorna mentioned, I think she mentioned, we got data from districts because DEED doesn't collect home language survey data. And nor do they collect English learner proficiency scores. So I'll just talk about why we think those 2 things are pretty important. First of all, for the home language survey, families fill those out for their incoming students, and one of the languages that they can write is English. And we believe that there are probably important differences in the educational needs and patterns, as well as the skill sets and assets of Alaska Native students who are primarily English speakers, whether it be standard American English or non-standard American English, versus students who are coming from bilingual households, growing up bilingual, or versus students who are growing up primarily with their heritage language as their primary language. Right now, DEED isn't able to look at differences across those linguistic profiles because they're not collecting that data. And this is true in other states as well. Similarly, we think it's important to collect that initial English proficiency test score because that really tells you about the speaking, listening, reading, and writing skills and patterns of students as they're first coming into school in kindergarten, and we could understand better, for instance, compliance with state procedures and policies around English learner classification, and also evaluate the trajectories of students better if we knew sort of the English proficiency skills, the measured standard American English proficiency skills that students were coming in with. The second implication is that input is needed to really understand what's meant by that differentiated definition in ESSA. And so we put here this idea of giving input on what is a significant impact of a non-English language, but also as someone indeed pointed out to me, it's also really important to provide guidance on what it means to come from an environment. Does it mean your community, your village? Does it mean the family, your immediate family? Does it mean your extended family? What does that mean? And what's the motivation behind that differentiated definition? What's the goal in terms of the identification of Indigenous students into the English learner category, specifically when those students may not be speaking their heritage language as their primary language. Third, we definitely found a pattern where English learner student resources and services are important for districts that are serving Alaska Native students. And as Lorna was just talking about, we saw, a handful of districts that were, for instance, using English learner supports to support heritage language revitalization efforts within the districts. And that's a really important resource, obviously, for students and for schools and districts. However, we saw across the board in our interviews that those resources may not be sufficient, and that relatively few districts from their English learner service plans were tailoring English learner supports to meet the unique skills and unique needs of Alaska Native English learner students specifically. We also just saw that Alaska Native English learner students tend to be clustered in schools with high resource needs, and the kind of support that's coming from English learner funding is not sufficient to meet those needs. And finally, we found that in Alaska, reclassification rates are low across the board, but acutely low amongst Alaska Native English learner students. And this indicates a real need to evaluate English learner student supports and resources, and also to think through reclassification criteria. And I'm happy to say in that regard, my understanding is that DEED has changed the reclassification criteria in the past months or over the past year. And so it will be interesting for DEED or others to evaluate whether we see changes in reclassification patterns now that there's fewer reclassification criteria for students. So with that, our questions that we wrote down for discussion. But again, we really want to hear anything that you want to say. So first, do these findings align with what you've seen in your work? Second, how can these findings help inform English learner policies and services, as well as Indigenous education in Alaska? How can you use these findings in your work, and what questions do these findings raise for you? And we can stop recording now, Jenny, if that's okay. And if you are comfortable.